But I'd like to understand more like your thought process, because you're aware of it, but all the Marines below you aren't, right? Like we're all, as a junior Marine, you're like, oh, this general, this guy that, he's the commanding general. He's this huge figurehead. And usually when he comes around, my life gets stressful because I have all this extra tasks I have to take care of.
Yeah.
And, you obviously, so you grow to that position. So I want to talk about that, but I want to start back to how you came in the military, and how you originally looked at the general officers. And was that kind of something that you pursued, or you thought like, hey, I'll achieve that one day?
Yeah. Well, okay. So first, let me just offer this. I mean, for context, I feel like I'm always looking out of the eyes of a first lieutenant. And by that, I mean, you kind of figure out who you are, and you have this image in your mind. As a Marine, I'm sure it's the same with my friends who were in the Army, of who you are, and you see yourself as that first lieutenant, kind of where you first kind of got it's almost probably like being a corporal or a sergeant. You start to figure out, okay, I kind of figure out where I am in the game right now. And I have to, like, only when I'm shaving, or I see a picture of myself that I think, my God, man, you're really old. And so the idea, I think, always is, for me, I look at these interactions with Marines as invaluable. The more senior you get, officer or enlisted, the danger is you're constantly getting processed information. Yeah. People will tend to tell you, first of all, they've rehearsed briefs, they've done all these things, and it's very processed. And it's like it's like the difference between, like going out on a Saturday night and, at 2 a.m, you're going through Del Taco. And, it may taste good in the moment and be satisfying in the moment, but it does nothing to fulfill you, to nourish you. And so I'm always looking for information that is not processed. And the way you do that is by interacting with people who didn't expect to be briefing you. And so you have to achieve a skill of putting people at ease and comfortable and talking about things that they care about, that they're informed about, and that they have enough confidence to tell you, shoot you straight. So what you described is, kind of a constant struggle that I personally have to deal with all the time, and but it's something I enjoy. I stayed in because I actually like Marines, and I like being around them. But to answer your question about how I came in, I was in law school. I grew up with a guy who enlisted into the Marine Corps when we graduated from high school. It shocked me. It was a paradigm that was just totally out of my mind. Didn't really understand it. And he left for the Marine Corps. I left for college, and we used to write letters to each other. This is the very early '80s now. And he would send me letters from, wherever he was, and I would send him letters back from, the University of Kansas. And that went on for a while. I ended up graduating from college, went to law school. Was finishing my first year of law school. I finished my first year of law school, starting my second, and I wasn't really what I wanted. And a recruiter came to campus, and I thought, oh, this would be a funny letter to Rob. So I went and interviewed to write a funny letter. And the next thing you know, this recruiter saw me coming a mile away. And he dialed me right in, and the next thing you know, I'm in Quantico, and that's how I came in the Marine Corps. And I actually came in on a law contract. I'm the grandson of immigrants, so quitting was not an option. So I wasn't going to quit law school. Graduated, went and got my license, went to Quantico. And when I was there, it's when I really realized, hey, I think what I really want to do is see if I can make it in the fleet and earn the respect of Marines and become a legitimate leader, And so I ended up, long story short, having to do the carpet dance a number of times and dropped my contract and ended up as an infantry officer.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because obviously law is one of those ones that I'm sure they didn't want to give up that contract, because I'm sure it's hard to find lawyers that want to join the Marine Corps, people pursuing law at least. Yeah,
I can't tell you like what it is now, what it was like now. Like every recruiter gets if you could tick one of those off, whether it's an air contract or a law contract, there are requirements, that have to happen all the time. And so I don't really know. I went, what really made it clear to me was I was in Quantico when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq in 1990. And I was kind of finishing up, and that cemented it in my mind. I thought, man, I just cannot, because, at that time, we were being told all kinds of crazy things about what was going to happen in that war and how long it was going to last.
Mm-hmm.
And I just could not, I remember, having a moment where I'm like, I just can't do this. I can't go, for me personally, I just couldn't go and do a bunch of wills for reservists as they went off to war kind of thing. And so that's what I thought in my mind. And so I went and did a series of hey, sir, I'd like to drop my contract, blah, blah, blah. And they did what Marines do really well. They tested my resolve. They screwed with me, did a number of things to make me think I was going to go to Hawk missiles, which was a thing back then, and other things. I thought, there's no way. I'm beating my tail off here. I'm going to make it to infantry officer school. And so they called my bluff. They basically said, okay, your MOSs are going to come out tomorrow, and you're going to be a Hawk missile Marine. And I said, and I remember thinking in my head, which is so funny because I'm a second lieutenant standing in a position of attention in front of the senior officers. And I said, okay. And I remember thinking, okay, call their bluff, which was not who I was. I called, I said, okay, roger that, sir. Then I'll be, let's do it.
Yeah.
And the next morning I woke up and there was my name on the dot matrix printout. They posted it on the door. They taped it up to a door in the passageway, and it said, Bellon 0302. And so I made it into the infantry.
So I imagine something like the infantry, going through infantry officers course, at that point where you haven't gone through it, it kind of seems like a heavy task, right? You're looking at this, like the reason that people want to go do it is because it's not easy. And to say you completed something like that is like, wow. So when you got selected to go become an infantry officer, was it kind of like, hell yeah, fuck, kind of like, oh, now I got to go through this.
Yeah, like everything else. Like yeah, you want to go to basic reconnaissance course, you want to travel force recon, or you want to get, I'm sure it's like all those things. You struggle and fight and compete so hard. It's the dog that catches the bus, and then you catch it, and you're like, okay, oh my God, Yeah, of course. I've been really blessed because I've always respected whatever it was that was in front of me. And I always had, like those pregame jitters and a healthy amount of anxiety and respect for what was about to unfold. So I made sure that I took it seriously and prepared and competed hard. I've never been in a position where I thought, oh, I'm so much better than everyone here. I'm going to just mail this one in and it's going to be easy. Never.
I'm not sure how plugged in you are with the training command, but how different is IOC now compared to when you went through it?
Yeah, it's even harder. I mean, they just added another 5 weeks, I believe. I was just there, so
wow.
I'm really blessed. Sergeant Major Ruiz, who's my sergeant major, we get invited to speak to every single company of lieutenants that goes through the basic school in Quantico. For those people that don't know, all Marine lieutenants get trained in the exact same place, and they all go through the same curricula. The first 6 months is exactly the same. And then from there, that's why they call it the basic school. So everyone learns call for fire. They learn weapons. They learn crew serve weapons. They learn, everything from admin to first aid to, you name it. Mm-hmm. And then they move on to flight school or wherever they're going. And for infantry officers, you literally go right across the street. And so they just added, in the basic training of infantry Marines, both on enlisted and officers, we just added additional time to imbue in that initially trained Marine a higher sense of proficiency and more skills. And I'll tell you, it was everything I could do to get through it. We competed hard. The physical condition and the want to of the second lieutenants that I went through was tremendous. And so, yeah, it was, let me put it this way. I have never been more prepared for a job in my entire career than I was when I drove off of Quantico the first time to go get my first platoon. They had trained me exceptionally well. Mm-hmm. And since then, that was the first time I was ready, rip roaring and ready to go. Let's go it and do it. After that, every time I've been nervous. Am I ready for this? Is this prepared? From the time I was a captain, let's say, all the time to where I became a lieutenant general.
Now, do you think that sense of preparedness correct? Like you actually did show up and know what you needed to know, or did you show up and like, oh, okay, now I got to learn how the fleet's doing it?
Like technically and tactically, absolutely. We could. The amount of patrolling they had us do, the weapons handling they had us do, live fire maneuver, call for fire, all those basic infantry skills, those things you have to know, like where you are on the planet. So if something goes wrong, you can call for medevac or call for fire or whatever. All those things we were exceptionally well trained. But at the end of the day, we're in the human being business, and how you relate to Marines, how you connect to Marines, how you wield your authority as a leader of Marines, and travel that spectrum of leadership skills. Those are all things that you learn from the Marines themselves, really.
For sure.
So you can't possibly be prepared. You can be a Mustang, you can be prior enlisted, but even sometimes those Marines have a hard time because they'll come back and they still want to play the position of a staff sergeant and not a lieutenant. And that's disruptive. So we all have to learn. Nobody shows up ready in that regard.
Yeah, I could see that. What was going through your head on the first time you stood in front of your first platoon? What battalion were you with? And what was the feelings that were going through, like, oh, I'm here now. Yeah. This is for real.
2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. And they just got back. It's like I closed with them. They were coming back because, I finished my training and the Desert Storm was over. I was in the infantry officers course, and it was over in 4 days. Mm-hmm. So, I got sent to 29 Palms as they were coming back. And so I was very, I wouldn't say they were getting off the bus, but it was pretty close to that. And so one of my earliest memories was in a Charlie's inspection, and they all had 2 rows of ribbons, and I couldn't wrap my head around that. I never saw a Marine with 2 rows of ribbons, Yeah. And then, like, right out of the gate, I was really lucky. We got sent out on an LST 1187, the USS Tuscaloosa, the Battle Gator, and we floated up the West Coast. And and the whole time I'm thinking, holy cow, these guys are combat vets, and in the back of your head, you're like, okay, you got to establish credibility. And we got fragged on the ship that we were going to pull into Vancouver. And at the time, the Canadian Rangers, which were called the Princess Patricia Light Infantry, okay, they had a battalion based out on their West Coast battalion was based out of Vancouver. We pulled in British Victoria, and they did what's called a bug out. So they recalled all these guys in, and we ran a full-blown tactical scenario that night. We got off the ship. They split us up in my company up into platoons, and we attached into Canadian companies. And I remember being on the deck of the LST before we went down the gangplank to get ashore, and telling my new platoon, hey, listen, you're all combat vets. These guys are going to respect the hell out of you. Let's be professional. Let's not embarrass anybody. Let's be humble and be professional. We're all face painted and stuff. Long story short, we had an amazing 36 hours of just boats and hiking and ambushes. And at one point, I'm at the front of my platoon. I'm following the company, and they go down, and all these Princess Patricia soldiers go down in the underbrush, and they're putting vegetation into their packs, and they're improving their camis, and they're covering their weapons, and just like we were trained in Quantico. Mm-hmm. I thought, damn, these guys are way better than we thought. This is good. And I look over my shoulder, and there's my Marines sitting on their ass up against a tree, going totally admin, opening an MRE. They weren't even close to as good as the guys we were following around. Yeah. So I got over my intimidation or concern immediately. I realized, okay, I'm here to train them. It's all good. And I knew my position on the field at that point.
Yeah. Did the other officers in the battalion that came back have lessons for you? Like, hey man, this is what I thought before, this is I thought of how it was going to be, but this is how it really is. This is what we saw.
Yeah. So what happens as an officer is you'll come to the fleet, and of course everybody's got more experience than you. So there may be somebody you think is salty that's got 6 months of fleet time. Yeah. I mean, even the captains have 4 or 6 years. It's not sure. So, but they seem like, that's the skipper. So I think what happens is every mentor, you match up with somebody personality wise who kind of gives you the gouge and, and helps you, and, the NCOs, I was really fortunate in that I connected immediately with a few of the NCOs, not inappropriately at all, but immediately. And we were shot each other very straight. I mean, even after that fiasco that I talked about, I remember being in my little stateroom on an LST, which is like a broom closet, mm-hmm. and having the NCOs, the sergeants. I was lucky I had 2 sergeants, at the time, which was a lot. And I brought them into my room and said, "Man, what do you think?" And they basically sir, we sucked. I mean, it was terrible, and we just talked it out. It wasn't an emotional thing. We just talked it out, level bubble, so to speak. And I've always been really lucky in that regard, and I would say the Marines probably helped me early days more than any one officer did. I had a really good company commander, though. Really good company commander.
Yeah, I mean, all of those things matter, especially at the company commander level. If your company commander is not dependable, or maybe they're way more aggressive or something with the Marines than they should be, then it's just miserable. It's just a miserable situation, and you don't really want to absorb any information from these people because you don't respect them.
That's right.
So having a solid NCO corps and having good leadership is definitely, that's an awesome opportunity. It's really unfortunate. I bet it really affects officers as they move through their careers if they had bad mentorship early on, if they had bad NCOs or bad staff NCOs.
Sure. 100%. My first platoon sergeant, I won't mention any names, was awful. He dropped out of runs. He was just a mess. It was a mess. My corporals were way more talented and professional than he was, Mm-hmm. And so we navigated around him. I had a great first sergeant who was just like a piece of, rawhide leather, just, old. He looked like he was probably 38 years old, He just looked like the classic guy smoking on a hump break, and, lieutenant, and he gave me great advice, funny, And so I never lost faith, but I saw my buddies who had jerked as first company commanders or, personality issues within their initial units that they never really got over, and they got out. Mm-hmm. They get out. That's what happens. They have a terrible perspective on Marines either way.
Oh, for sure. It's the same thing. It's the same kind of experience for enlisted guys. If you show up and all your corporals, you expect a little bit of hey, you're the new guy, you're going to get messed with a little bit and stuff like that. But if you show up and your corporals are making your life a living hell, or sergeants or whatever every day, why would you want to hang around? Yeah. Why would you want to do anything for these people?
One of the things we fear the most in the fleet, right, is the pickup day when we get the new PSCs and Lance Corporals in, and you're out there trying to make sure you're setting the conditions for what's going to happen in the barracks when you're not there, and so you're trying to recruit the reliable Marines, and you're also trying to forewarn these young Marines, and the whole time you're just like, oh Lord Jesus, please, because you don't know what's going to happen. And I can only imagine these guys are 10 feet tall, or these Marines are 10 feet tall when they get their Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, mm-hmm. and they hit the fleet ready to fulfill this, this dream, and they're just abused in some cases. And that is, we got to be better than that. I mean, it's just awful.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a difference between messing with a guy, he's a new guy, and, messing around and stuff, and actual abuse. And I think of most people, I don't think there's any kind of pushback from the average Marine's not going to be like, no, we want to abuse, we want to beat the crap out of these guys when they show up. I remember as a corporal, I picked up corporal and I got blood striped horribly. Yeah. I got pulled into a trailer and all my NCOs just beat the crap out of my legs. And then we had an NCO run with the sergeant major the following day. And, so just to top it off. And then the next month, my buddy got promoted. And I'm like, oh, yeah, here we go. Get the blood stripe. Boom. And I remember, I think I was the first one that kneed him. And I kneed him in the thigh. And he turned ghost white and almost passed out. And I felt like such a piece of shit. And that was the last time I ever did that. I was like, dude, one, my bad, dude. I didn't mean to, I didn't mean for it to be like that. Two, I've got a family and stuff. This isn't worth my career doing this stupid shit.
So, Justin, it turns out you're not a sociopath. That's good.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Jeez. Yeah. I hope the word on the street is not that.
My son's a Marine, and we talk about this stuff all the time. It's a lot of times, especially anymore, oftentimes I should say, lieutenants will come to the fleet and they have done a lot of fighting. A lot of, you do a lot of ground fighting and mixed martial arts, and it's just part of getting you conditioned to interpersonal violence and things like that. And some of them were college athletes. So in general, and you've seen this yourself, oftentimes, especially in the combat arms, from a physical conditioning perspective, they've been trained and their bodies are developed in a way that is significantly above average of your average Marine. And so they'll get to the fleet and they will conflate establishing credibility with measuring that out. Like used to the old saw, you've seen it yourself, where the lieutenant's going to take you out for a run. He's going to step off at a 6-minute pace and smoke everybody.
Miserable.
But now, as we got into the kind of the mixed martial arts era, the younger officers will fight with the Marines, do combatives with the Marines. And I try to explain to them, it's like, hey, the whole purpose here is to help the Marines gain confidence. Mm-hmm. And so if you're abusive to them, or if you're slaking your own fragile ego at their expense, it's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. Now, on the other hand, if you get in there with some dude who played a year of college football and he takes you, you better be ready, because he doesn't have the same perspective, Yeah. So these are conversations we have all the time.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that every individual leader has to kind of work out. There's so many scenarios that you run into every day, week, throughout your career, where you have to consider, like, okay, this would be cool, but is this like the right thing to do? Is this the cool thing, or is this the leadership thing? And it's like, it's got to be tough. At what point as an officer were you told, like, hey man, hopefully you got all the cool stuff out of your system, because now you're a staff guy? Because at some point, every officer just becomes a staff guy, unfortunately, and it becomes more planning than field time.
Yeah, it's not. Well, that's true. But it's not true that you don't ever see yourself. Look, I'm just talking from a first person here, okay? Mm-hmm. But also my friends, you don't see yourself as a staff guy. You see yourself as, a MAGTF Marine or a well-rounded Marine, because anything can happen. I mean, anything can happen. You might go out on a deployment as an assistant, whatever, OPSO or whatever, and the next thing you know, somebody's wounded or killed, and you're a company commander. So you better have your stuff in one bag. And you better have imaged your way through all those things. You don't want to be figuring it out in contact. And I know that might sound dramatic, Justin, to potentially younger Marines who may be listening, or younger soldiers, or people that are considering going in because there isn't a war on right now in their mind. But that happens. Those things happen. People get relieved, people get wounded, people get injured, and you better be ready. So you're always working on your craft. Yeah. And then when you're in those staff positions, ideally, you're learning at the higher end of how to employ and protect the force. So by the time you become a battalion commander, and instead of being a platoon commander where you're responsible for 40 or 50 Marines, by the time you're a battalion commander, my battalion task force was 1,800 Marines when I was in Iraq. 1,800, spread up and down the Euphrates River Valley in a way that if I hadn't have had other jobs before between company command and battalion command, I wouldn't have had any idea how to deal with that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a staff weenie perspective. Sometimes you feel sorry for yourself, but you know that it's part of the profession. You're trying to learn as you go.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's anyone that's not trying to learn, that's in the military, then they're only hurting themselves and the organization.
It shows. It shows.
Yeah, it should be constant improvement. It should be constant, like within your own field. You should, especially if you're like a sergeant or a staff NCO. Like you should know the answer if there's a question, and if you don't know the answer, you got to at least know where to find it, exactly. and be rapid about it. And it's the guys that can't do that, or don't want to. Some guys refuse to learn all the aspects of their trade. They only like one particular part of their job, so they only want to focus on that. To be honest, once I became a JTAC, I was like, I don't want to go back and learn a FATIDS. Like, I don't want to keep up with a FATIDS. So I'm guilty of it as well, but it's something that you have to do, though, right? Because I didn't know, like, hey, my next job after leaving Anglico was going to be the fires chief with the MEU. And it was like, well, you better know a FATIDS, man. Because that's literally, it's all, your life is nothing but computer systems now.
So, I mean, you just kind of touched on something, let me ask you this. So I like I said, we get to speak to every single lieutenant in the basic school, and all of them are eaten up with, they're trying to play the movie in their mind about, how do they relate to the Marines? How do they, and all of them, because they're human and they're young, regardless of what they say, everybody wants to be liked, right? Mm-hmm. And so they spend a disproportionate amount of their time and bandwidth sometimes worrying about things like that. And what Sergeant Major Ruiz and I always tell them is, hey, rule number one is you must know your job. You've seen young leaders, officers, or staff NCOs who spend way more time being popular, with Marines. Mm-hmm. But then when things get real, when you're like, marching up to the flight deck to get on a helicopter and it's turning and you're going to do it for real, or you're in an assembly area someplace, you're about to go do it for real. If you if that really popular officer or leader is over there, you look at them, you begin to hold them in contempt because you're not sure if they know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I take it a step farther. The last thing I want a sergeant to be thinking about in that moment in the assembly area is me. I should have disappeared from his or her imagination completely. And all they're doing thinking is, okay, pre-combat checks, pre-combat inspections. Do I have all the checkpoints? Do I know all the freaks? Do I, all those things?
Mm-hmm.
Your work is largely done at that point. And so, trying to make sure they understand the priority is knowing your job. And if you do, the Marines are uncannily good about being fair with you. Mm-hmm. You may have an odd personality, but if you know your job and you're fair, they'll forgive you of all those other things.
Yeah. That's something I've brought up a few times. I've told people, I'm like, you got to bring something to the table.
Yeah.
If you're an asshole, but you're really good at your job, then I'll deal with it. I'll deal with it because you are good at your job. You make things happen.
Especially if you're an asshole all the time. If you're consistently, you're fair about it.
And I know guys like that. I know guys that no one else likes. I have a buddy that I won't mention his name, but no one likes the guy. And I'm like, hey, I had to sit next to him for basically 6 months in Afghanistan. So I learned his personality. So we get along really, we get along well and stuff like that. Yeah. But if you're an asshole, but you're also bad at your job, then what are you doing here other than slowing us down and making life difficult? Especially for an officer or staff NCO that now has to deal with whatever issues you're bringing to the table that, not only are you garbage at your job, but I can't even trust you to, take care of yourself or whatever. So yeah, that's definitely key. I mean, I always told my Marines, I was like, look, the only thing I expect from you is to show up when I tell you to be there, do what I tell you to do, and just be good at your job. Like anything outside of that, I mean, that sounds really basic or whatever. Maybe I'm watering it down way too much, but the expectation is just show up and be ready to learn. Yeah. Or if you're an NCO, show up and be ready to teach and lead, because that's the expectation. That's where you're at along this path. For the 0861s, it was kind of tough sometimes. I was a lap mover, so I came over to the 0861 MOS as a sergeant, not knowing anything.
From what?
I was a motor team mechanic.
Okay.
I came in open contract like a not smart person, and got assigned to be a mechanic. And it was funny. I showed up to 10th Marines, and everybody was like, "Oh, welcome. This place sucks." People were like, "Oh, get ready." And I'm like, "This is awesome," because I've been over at MLG turning wrenches from 7 a.m. till 5 p.m. And I'm like, we get to go to the field. We're gonna go shoot guns. Like, this is awesome. And it was like such a different.
You're like, those are real howitzers. We're rolling around.
Like, hey, because the feeling at maintenance battalion, it was hard to say. It was hard to be like, oh, I'm a Marine. Because I didn't even have a rifle assigned to me. When you don't get a rifle until you go to the rifle range, because there's no reason for Lance Corporal Kramer 3521 to have a rifle in the rear. We're not going to the field. And the few times that we did go to the field, it was like static setup. Like, hey, let's set up some stuff. All right, this was cool. We're here for a day. Let's go back. What are we doing out here? Mm-hmm. So going to 10th Marines was a different experience for me. And then it was also like, as an NCO, now I'm a sergeant, and I don't know anything. I'm having one of the other sergeants show me how to plot on a map, like literally, because I've never done it before. Yeah. And what I'm getting at is
what year was that, Justin? What year was that?
I lap moved while I was in Iraq in 2009. I got to 210 in November of 2010. And then I deployed with 3-6 as the fires chief in 2011.
Wow.
Yeah, I was really lucky that I had Dustin Klein, who's now retired. He was a master sergeant. He was out at Fort Sill as an instructor as well. He was my first chief, and he was just a walking knowledge. He was the guy. It was one of those environments where we could kind of do what we wanted within the battalion because the battalion commander had complete faith and trust in him. Because we continually show up to the field. We're the first ones that got comm up. We no issues on, there's no issues on our end, to the point where I remember we would go out to brag for Rolling Thunder or something like that. And the battalion commander would want to get away from his staff. So he'd come out to the FSCC because he knew all of our radios worked, and him and the sergeant major would come out there so they could relax a little bit, but also monitor what's going on.
Yeah.
So I was really lucky to have that kind of leadership. But I guess to bring it all back around, what I was talking about was the 0861 MOS promotes so quickly that sometimes you have these corporals and sergeants that are like 20 years old, 21 years old. And maybe it isn't that way anymore, but this is how it used to be. Mm-hmm. So do you think there's an issue with like maturity in an MOS like that where where they promote quickly? Because part of it is because it's such a stressful job. So many people get out.
Yeah.
Where do you see that on your level, at the high level, where we're having corporals and sergeants that are 20, 21 years old drop live ordnance, and we're okay with that?
Well, I'll give you a thought, and then I'll give you an example of something that I remember. So I think, first of all, like right now, when you start talking about force design and the commandant's initiatives with talent management, kind of broad terms like age of the force are used. And what we really mean by that is to imbue in the individual Marines higher capabilities. Mm-hmm. So they're capable of more responsibility, but also are technically much more capable Marines. All right. So the idea, when you say age, that's a temporal term. That's, a time. That means an older Marines, we think, right? Because the assumption there is that it just takes a little more time to mature that level of professional. However, you yourself, you know this from your own personal experience. I remember, it's a long story, but I ended up as the intelligence officer for 1st Marine Regiment, Regimental Combat Team 1, in both battles of Fallujah in 2004 and 5. And halfway through the deployment at the 7-month mark, the regiment turned over. I was an activated reservist, so I basically said, hey, I'll stay. Because I knew we were about to get into the second attack was out there, mm-hmm. And I had my reasons. And so in that second tranche of Marines that showed up was this Lance Corporal named Morales, Eli Morales. He looked like he was 12. He walks into the COC, reports in, and I just could not believe it. We've been banging for over 7 months now in that city. It was pretty much on from the day we got there. It was just helicopters came and went and brought new people, but it kept going. Yeah, in fact, sure. our regimental commander, if you remember the story, he got wounded the day of the change of command. A rocket came in and hit our CP hours after he took command, Larry Nicholson, and he was grievously wounded. And we had Marines killed in that strike right on the CP, the CP. And so in the middle of all this, Morales shows up, and what I remember about him showing up was how young he looked, my God, and didn't really give it another thought. Fast forward, within weeks, he and this guy named Corporal Stuart Greenfield, our issue was we were trying to find out where the cells of the insurgents were inside the city, because in the first battle, their interior mobility along their interior lines of communication gave us a lot of trouble. We would advance forward, and then they would slip around like a rat on an linoleum floor, behind us, and create geometry problems, and just slowed us down. So we were trying to think of ways that we could fix them, as we penetrated deeper into the city on the second attack. But we had to find them first. And Morales and Greenfield figured it out. They reasoned, okay, who are these guys? They're a bunch of, guys from an individual from Yemen paired up with some other dudes who was recruited, and they're put in these cells. And what can't they do? They can't do their own laundry probably, but they can figure that out. But they sure as hell can't cook. So there's probably, in their term, a roach coach that goes around and drops off chow. And so their thought was, if we can find the roach coach, which will be moving around at night, we can plot out where all these cells are. And they did it. They stayed up, they took the night watch, and we had all kinds of ISR up over the city, surveillance up over the city at that time. And old Eli Morales and Stuart Greenfield figured it out. And, as the attack opened, we did a number of things leading up to the attack, but we had a B-1 bomber come in and drop JDAMs on all those, boom, and then knew how to fix them. And it helped our situation. Didn't solve it, of course, for sure. But it greatly, and so now he's a lieutenant colonel. We took him from that deployment and sent him immediately to the Naval Academy. First job he ever had out of school was he went to war with 1st Marine Regiment, and by the time he left, he had a handwritten endorsement from the regimental commander and got admitted into the Naval Academy, and now he's I think he's a MU intel officer. Yeah. So my way of saying that, yeah, age is a factor, but it just hasn't been my experience that it's the factor when it comes to, MOSs and rank. I'm MOS and rank agnostic when you're doing it for real, because the environment's always changing, and some of these breakthroughs are going to come from that corporal if you're willing to listen to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I could see that for sure. I understand what you're saying. I guess when I say age, I guess it wasn't necessarily maturity, but I look at the, if you've only been in the fleet for 6 months, I'm probably not going to let you go do call for fire by yourself.
That's right.
Even though you've been through the school, even though you've probably been through some field ops and stuff like that, but at some point we have to okay, well, this guy is good enough to do that. And sometimes, and what I kind of pointed out, like in an MOS, like an 0861, you get promoted really quickly. Other MOSs, like an infantry MOS, you get promoted extremely slowly. Yeah. So now, like a sergeant in the infantry seems like it means different. It's a different meaning almost sometimes than it is in other MOSs. What do you think about that?
No, I think I think we're talking about how people perceive it, right?
Yeah.
Not institutionally, a sergeant's a sergeant's a sergeant, but not every sergeant is the same. You may get 4 sergeants that report into a unit, and there's one that's just an absolute, incredible, and you can give him or her, wide-ranging responsibilities, and your relationship with that human being takes on a completely different, style. And you may have 2 that couldn't lead a squadron nuns through silent prayer. I don't know, so you're always paying attention. And, your job, as your job as a staff NCO or as an officer is to fairly assess where that Marine is and then coach them up and then put them in positions where they will succeed. But it doesn't mean everybody's going to have the same job or even the same potential. That's just reality.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I've said that a lot about people through different levels of the service. Like there's guys that I like that probably shouldn't be in the Marines. Horrible Marines, great people. There were guys that were great fire supportmen, doing call for fire, they're forward observers, but they weren't great as a JTAC. It's a different kind of job, and it's a different kind of mentality, and it takes like a different level of thinking.
And you don't know.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
You don't know until they're working, right? Until you're really working with them. And then that's your responsibility as a leader to make those really difficult calls and make sure it's not personal.
Yeah, for sure.
You're making fair professional calls because we're about the mission. And it just seems to me, regardless of what rank you are, if you do your best to maintain that level of fidelity in your responsibilities, the Marines have an uncanny understanding of what's fair and right. The second you start making it about yourself, or you're inconsistent, or you play favorites, it is so disruptive.
It was easy to not do that within the JTAC community, just because the seriousness of the job required
the complexity.
Yeah, and it was easy to be like, hey, man, I just can't trust you to drop bombs. Like, this is a no-fail kind of thing. You can't mess this up, because the impact of you, and this was something I tried to tell guys when we'd be on the OP, and you'd see them, you get OP CAS or call for fire where it's like, we're out on the same OP for the 50th time. I know the target grid already, and they're calling it in, and maybe it's off a little bit. And I'm like, what would you do in real life? In real life, you're not going to let ordnance continue to rain down on something that wasn't your target. That could be a friendly building. That could be something, something else completely. I'm like, you got to look at it like that, and not like, we're on the OP again. And the seriousness,
and you may not have a stack of CAS above you. You may have one, and you better get it on. So it's that's the JTAC. What a great job. Oh, maybe out there listening, considering doing that. Go do that.
I'll tell you what, I told all kinds of people while I was in, I was like, you know what? I would stay a staff sergeant for 20 years if they just let me be a JTAC. Like all the other stuff I don't care about, so I guess we can I want to talk retention and stuff like that, and kind of the reserves and things like that. But before I do that, I want to back up just a second and talk about, you were in OIF 1 with 4th LAR, correct? As the OPSO?
That's right.
What's that like? Because for people that may not know what an operations officer does, you're the guy that's formulating the plan for your battalion. You're putting together your piece of the puzzle to make sure the bigger plan that's coming down from above, all kind of works. It's a huge responsibility, and it could be a captain or a major doing that position. Yeah. What was Tell us about that. Tell us about the complexity of building a legitimate attack plan. You're about to go invade a country. What's going through your mind? What rank were you at the time? And did you feel like you were ready for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I had on 9/11, I was a reserve company commander, coming to the end of my reserve time, and Alpha Company 4th LAR. I hope that you got some listeners out there that were in that unit, and we had the most amazing group of staff NCOs. And in fact, the only reason I'm sitting here today, a guy named Phil Mathias and Steve Craig and Evan Guevara and Dennis Daly and on. They were just phenomenal. I'd been in the company, some of them for 10 years. And so they knew, they just knew, they knew their craft. We're all reservists. We all have, other jobs and lives. But we took it very seriously. We took before 9/11, we took our unit and our drill weekends very seriously. And because I had these kind of like senseis that were in my unit, we would actually meet between drills, and we would go to places like Big Bear and other places and look around for training areas and say, what if we tried this? And what if we tried that? And that summer, we got the golden ticket to do what's called an extended annual training in Australia. So we took the company to Australia, and we got attached to the Australians' 2 Cav Regiment. And we worked for this guy named Mick Krause, who was the closest thing to being jumped into Hell's Angels I could ever imagine. And we did some crazy stuff in the Shoalwater Bay training area. We're getting chased around by Australian tanks, and we're firing the Bushmaster chain gun, in the trees. We're going through trees, bushwhacking, firing it was crazy. And we all came out of there supremely confident. And I remember one of them, I think we stopped at Pearl Harbor on the way back. One of them actually said, this is late August 2001, said something like, hey, it's too bad we didn't get a chance to go to war together, because, I was about to change command and other people were about to leave. I remember somebody said that, and it wasn't weird, because, when you're on the team and you're practicing all the time, it was like, hey, you want to play the game,
Yeah,
it sounds awful. That's reality. And so I knew my craft very well. So when 9/11 happened, in very short order, they pulled me into the battalion and said, you're going to be the OPSO when we go to war. And we didn't get mobilized until about a year later. So I had a year, to get my act together. And so by the time I went home for Christmas, I had, not home, I lived in San Diego, but I had a wife and young children, and I have a family back in St. Louis. And so I called my battalion commander at the Christmas of 2002, I guess, and said, hey, I'm flying back to St. Louis. Is there any reason I shouldn't go? Are we good? I'm going to go have Christmas with my extended family. He goes, no, go ahead. We're fine. I get there, and like December 26th, I get a phone call, come back immediately. You and pick 2 more Marines are going to fly out to the East Coast. There's an amphibious task force forming off the East Coast. You're going to fly out to the ships, embark, and go over with them, and we're going to get strat lifted over and meet you in Kuwait. Holy shit, Yeah. So I picked the Camo, who I didn't know, who was brand new. Because I figured, boy, if they're going to meet us in stride and we're crossing the line of departure, we better have our comm tight, because we're going to be out front. We got to be able. And I picked the fire sport coordinator, because I thought we better know what the fire sport coordination measures are, again, because we're going to be in and out of friendly lines, and want to make sure we understand what the measures were. So the 3 of us flew to Camp Lejeune, got on a helicopter, CH-53, flew out to the USS Baton and floated over, and that took a month. And so, we're immersed in this every day. But long story short, by the time we crossed the line of departure, for the conventional part of the attack, I was I don't remember being nervous about knowing my job or not, because it was so much. It's like being the offensive coordinator in the Super Bowl. You know what I mean? You're so into it. You're running through the plays constantly that it just unfolds that way. When it switched to an insurgency, we got caught in southern Baghdad, like when it really changed. And that was an entirely different game. And we got converted into this task force with force recon and some ODAs and some EOD. And we were in these towns called Mahmudiya, Latafiya, and Yusufia in the summer of 2003. And that was a completely different game. And that was more like sandlot football.
Yeah. I guess that's as much as I hate being on ship, that's not a bad environment to be in if that's where you're headed. If you know you're heading to war, like you're completely immersed in the military. You can easily walk over to a supercomputer and pull stuff up if you need to. As miserable as ship life is, that's not a bad spot to be if you're planning for something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The only thing
Okay.
about that, we were at surge berthing, so you know what that is. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't even move on the ship. And then we got our anthrax shots on the ship. So you're in surge berthing and you're rubbing it. But it was like you said. I think what you're talking about is you were very isolated. You're getting your head and your heart right, and you're getting yourself ready to do what has to be done. You're not, like a volunteer fireman driving to a fire, worrying about who's going to pick up the kid. All that stuff's gone now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you're nothing back home it's not like you can just call home. And this was what year?
2003, like January, I think 2003. So there was no cell phone.
I imagine there was no internet on ship either. Or
No.
if there was, very limited.
Very limited.
So I don't think I've had anyone talk about 4th LAR's role within OIF-1. Where were you? Who were you guys attached to? Like what task force, and what was the role?
Some companies got divided out to active duty regiments, and they were attached to like Bravo Company was attached to, I want to say 3rd LAR, but they were chopped up. The battalion itself. So I got sent over with that small group, and we got assigned to 2nd Marines. And the theory was that the battalion headquarters and the remaining companies were going to be flown over and meet us in Kuwait, and we're all going to go up as part of 2nd Marines Task Force Tarawa. But when the 101st Airborne got turned around by Turkey, Turkey wouldn't let them come through to attack from the north. All the Strat Air got sucked up, and so in an instant, like 4th LAR evaporated. It wasn't in the game. So I actually crossed the line of departure and went into the Battle of Nasiriyah with the regimental trains. I was the navigator for the combat trains for 2nd Marines. That's basically my goal. I was helping navigate. And then EPW, early EPW, because it was just kind of loose, kind of help with that for 2nd Marines. And then right when we got through Nasiriyah, something had changed, and 4th LAR moved back up into priority for Strat Lift. And all of a sudden they found me like on the road to Al Qut and said, hey, 4th LAR is landing in Kuwait right now. You need to go back and bring them forward. So I can't even remember how it happened, but a CH-46 lands like on a highway. I jump in with these other 2 Marines, and we fly back to a place, near the Kuwaiti border. And we had a SATCOM, early SATCOM, and we got on and raised them, and we had a link up, and they came by. We jumped in like hitchhikers and drove north to Al Qut, and then ended up on the Iranian. We drove almost straight to the Iranian border. We were in Al Qut airfield for a little bit. Then we got pushed up to the Iranian border, which was crazy because the Iranians saw us, and doctrinally, of course, they study us. And what do they think when they see us? They think there's going to be a division attack because we're the forward element.
Yeah.
So they start pushing all this shit down to the border, and we're there facing off, and it was nuts. It was crazy. Yeah.
Is it weird to look back on those times and just be like, man, like, especially now, like what you're doing now, more high level stuff, you're just like, man, what was I doing back in the day?
Oh, yeah. Well, again, I had such confidence in the Marines that I had gotten to know there that it was like playing a fast break, Justin. You just, when you're on a good team, you know what I mean? You're on a good team, and okay, well, now we're going here. Okay, now we're going there. And it was so busy that it wasn't like there was a lot of contemplation about how crazy is this, except at night, like when you're looking at your thermals and you're seeing BMPs come down to the border on the other side, you're like, okay, this is crazy. So we ended up, long story short, we ended up parlaying with the Iranians, and that's a whole nother thing. But where it got really nuts is when we got moved into this counterinsurgency piece. The rest of the entire MEF, we got moved down to Al Hilla, which is Babylon, and the rest of the MEF was basically out in town buying bread and putting windows in girls' schools and stuff. It was a different war. And we're up there. We got sent up into southern, the area of kind of south of Baghdad and southeast of Fallujah, in this place later, the 101st Airborne called the Triangle of Death. And we started getting in contact like every night. And we're doing raids every night. And it was a totally different war in this little pocket. And the first time enemies found an IED in the MEF's zone, and we found these IEDs started popping up, and we start, shooting these guys in black tracksuits who were working in teams, and it was. And I'm sending reports back saying, "Hey, this is organized. This is not tribal. This is organized." And we actually hit a target one night and came out with, it is crazy. We came out with like U.S. Special Forces, like Green Beret literature about how to organize cells, the stuff they would have given in Eastern Europe in the 70s.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm like, hey, this is, and the weapons caches, the stuff they were taking, were clearly, they were shopping, like you go to Trader Joe's and you're shopping for specific things. So we're sending these reports like, this is organized, and they're getting better. And then a guy named Brigadier General, so we were working for General Mattis at the time. And then a guy named Brigadier General John Kelly, later General Kelly, later Chief of Staff of the White House Kelly, took real interest. He was a 1-star at the time. He started coming up. We're like, hey, sir, look, this is what's happening up here. And it was the front end of the insurgency, and we were brushing up against Fallujah and doing all these different patrols and stuff. And that's how I ended up on my second tour. Was I went home, and 1st Marine Division got alerted to go back, and I got a phone call. Like, when you're in the reserves, you're like kind of in the fantasy football draft. And I got a phone call from a couple colonels that I had got to know. One was John Toulon. He was 1st Marine Regiment, and the other was a guy named Joe Dunford, who later became commandant and chairman. And like, hey, we kind of want you to come back. You were up in this space. We're going to that space. Can you come? And I thought, well, shit, I'm going to be a watch officer, assistant watch officer. Sure. Let me talk to my wife. And I ended up as the intelligence officer for that unit going back. And that was a whole nother gig,
Yeah, especially, that's kind of odd, right? Coming out as a, one, you have a law background, and then you become an infantry officer. And then now you're going to go do intel work. Which I guess as an intel officer, or excuse me, as an infantry officer, you have a pretty good handle on intel anyways, like you should at least. Understanding intel and stuff like that. You may not have full understanding of collections and things like that, but I mean, there's worse MOSs, I think, to push into an infantry or intel officer spot.
Yeah, I matured a lot in my first combat deployment to Iraq because I was the guy, right before we went was, hey, we don't need the intelligence officer in the vehicle because we can get I literally said this, we can get our weather reports off the shortwave radio, off the,
pull up the BBC.
And then later on, it's like, you become, but what happened, like it has happened for me at every step of the way, I ran into exceptional professionals. And then, when I got orders to go back as an intel officer, my buddy, who was one of my platoon commanders when I was a company commander, gave me this little red pamphlet. And you remember those waterproof bags that used to be in your gas mask? Mm-hmm. It was folded up in that, and it was a World War II intel pub. You can almost hear the ice cubes clinking in the glasses of these two, probably Walt Disney executives that got demobilized and were writing about what they learned. And the gist of it, Justin, was I'm flying over was, hey, don't trust any reports you get. Go talk to the soldiers. Go talk to the Marines. So that's what I did initially. I would listen to all these intercepts from Radbin and all these other things. And then I would literally go out into the city or into the battalions. And, I remember crawling into a machine gun position one night saying, hey, I'm about to brief my bosses and this is what I'm going to tell them. What do you guys think? And they would tell me, oh, sir, that's a bunch of bullshit. Or, oh, yeah, that's pretty good. And I knew Marines. I had a first sergeant in 3.5 was a squad leader when I was in 2.7. I said, hey, first sergeant, I really need to talk to some sharp Marines because I'm going to go brief and I want to make sure that, what I'm saying represents what they believe and vice versa. So he got me in. I talked to some snipers one night in their hide and told them what I thought. And then next thing you know, I started getting invited to come. Hey, you should go talk to this guy. Because when I'm there, I'm giving the Marines the brief. I'm telling these sergeants and corporals that what I think is happening in the bigger picture. And they liked it. So I got great access throughout the regimental combat team. And that really helped me become an intelligence officer. And then, of course, every agency showed up under the sun. Delta Force showed up. Not Delta. They're not called Delta Force, but those guys showed up. CIA showed up. NGA showed up, and I got a master's class in being an intelligence officer.
Yeah, I think something you said there that they appreciated hearing those intel briefs is huge because I think that's one thing that a lot of Marines really just don't like. Is it's like, man, I'm operating in a vacuum here. I don't even know what we're doing. What's the mission? Why am I doing this? And maybe that's my own personality, but I was always a why guy. Why are we doing this? Does that make sense? Does this make sense that we're doing this? And obviously, Lance Corporal Kramer's not asking sergeants why; he's just doing it. But it's nice every once in a while when they give you, maybe they don't tell you right in that moment of when you're doing something, but give you some kind of feedback so I understand, oh, okay, now I kind of understand the bigger picture. Because not only are you keying me in on what's going on, But now that my understanding of everything is a little bit broader, maybe I have something to give back to the conversation, or maybe, some feedback up.
Yeah. That's exactly what happened. I would call it like priming the pump. I'd say, hey, this is what we think. This is what I'm going to brief. And and I would give them that. And the next time I would come around, first of all, they were paying attention in the interim, and they were ready to tell me something. Hey, sir, and most times it was good, sometimes it was crazy, but the whole point was it was an active dialogue going back and forth, and that's probably the reason I didn't get fired in that job, is that I had a perspective that other folks might not have had, because I was talking to the Marines.
What was the vibe of the intelligence at the time before, right? Like leading up to the first attack on Fallujah? Obviously, for the people that don't know, maybe, there was some contractors that got caught up in the city and ended up being hung from a bridge and burned. They were dragged, and it was horrible. The images are still out there. They're obviously horrific. And that's when like the first attack happened. But obviously that was just a match that set everything off. What was like the vibe at the time that led up to that event?
So we got sent over, and the irony is, when I left OF1, I turned over with some soldiers from the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne. They took over for Task Force Scorpion, and they also had Fallujah, and they were great guys. And I gave them all my maps, and I thought, my war's over. My combat experience, my Marine Corps career might be over. I mean, I kind of did what I came to do, and it's over. So I gave them everything. And so if you remember, in the media, somehow it got out that General Mattis was saying that when the Marines get over there, we know how to do COIN, we know how to do counterinsurgency, and we'll teach the Army how to do this kind of thing. So as small world here, myself, one of my great mentors in the Marine Corps, Sparky Renforth, who was the operations officer for RCT-1, now a major general running at 29 Palms for us, and a guy named Kevin Shea, who was our communications officer, who was later killed in that battle. The three of us got sent forward ahead of the regiment. The regiment was all, getting in Kuwait, getting all of our gear sorted, getting ready to go. And the three of us got flown forward to meet with the 3rd Brigade. And so we get there, and it's the same guys. I mean, literally, the same guys I gave my maps to like months earlier. Oh, you guys are here to show us how to do, counterinsurgency. And they got these. I'm like, oh fuck, And so they come back and they say, well, we're going into the city today. Why don't you come with us? Sparky couldn't go for some reason, but I went, and I think Kevin went too. And we get in these softback Humvees, and we go through what's called the Cloverleaf on the east side of the city. It was kind of a highway exchange. We go through there, and we made contact, straight away. And I'm talking like, 12.57s and RPGs coming in, 40 Mike and 50 cals going out. It was a long-running gunfight to get into the city, And we get into the city, and there was a key leader engagement in the Civic Center, one of those types of deals. And we're in there for, 20 minutes or so. And I'm just totally baggage now. I'm watching. And all the paratroopers start getting happy feet, and they start moving around. And I'm like, hey, what's up? And they said, hey, we're here too long. We're here too long. This is day one. And then sure enough, mortars start coming in. Lots of, automatic weapons fire starts coming in. And there are automatic weapons fire teams bounding under mortar fire, closing with we took 19 wounded on the first day in that meeting. Fight our way out, and again, I didn't do anything. I'm baggage, I'm just, and we come back, we got on the phone. I remember Sparky, we were talking to the regimental commander, and we were saying things back in Kuwait, like maybe we should leave the tanks in Kuwait. That's really aggressive. Tanks could be perceived as very aggressive. And so I remember Sparky picking up the phone and goes, hey, sir, bring the tanks, bring the tanks, bring the artillery, bring everything. It's not what we thought it was going to be. We're not going to be handing out butterscotches and soccer balls up here. And so in short order, so there was this like tinderbox, during the relief in place, it was just kind of brewing. And then when the contractors got caught in the city and those horrific images got up on CNN almost instantly, we were ordered hasty attack of the city tonight, immediately. Attack and secure the city. 2 battalions, boom, 1-5 and 2-1 come in from opposite corners. the northwest corner and the southeast corner of the city and attack in. And they make their way almost to the middle. They're almost about to like shake hands in the middle, and we're ordered to stop. And then we spent the next, I guess that was probably April. I think we went back in November. So that interim, that whole summer, in static lines, cordoning off the city, watching the dogs eat the dead in front of the Marines. It was awful. It was awful. Fighting, every night the enemy would bring more insurgents in, and they would come out and test us. We'd press them as new units came in. It was just this running crap deal that lasted all summer. Very frustrating for the Marines and soldiers who were involved. And then finally in November, we were told to secure the city and deliberate attack.
The politics finally caught up, is what happened there.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was just so untenable. It got to the point where we're watching them with cranes and bulldozers fortify the city, and the rules of engagement were such that we couldn't do anything. So we were constantly not playing games because we were being lawful. We were exploring the boundaries of the rules of engagement. Like at one point, you couldn't drop a joint direct attack munition, a JDAM, a bomb. Couldn't do that anymore. But we had what's called a MICLIC. You know what that is? The line charge that shot off a track. So a JDAM might be a 500-pounder, but a MICLIC is 2,000 pounds of explosives. So we needed a building cleared, and we couldn't drop a JDAM, so we drove a MICLIC forward and fired that thing, 4 times bigger than a JDAM, and until the rules changed again, can't do that. And that, it's the way it was.
That's the reality on the ground. That's the real, and commanders and stuff like that may think that they're doing the right thing by, oh no, you can't use that ordinance. Like, okay, well, I'm going to use something else. And it may not. That was one thing as a fires guy, when I was in Afghanistan, I didn't really understand. I was like, we have battalion level approval for conventional artillery and down. So basically conventional artillery, your regular 155 rounds, mortars, stuff like that. We can approve at the battalion. But I have to get regimental approval to shoot XCal or to shoot HIMARS, which are precision guided, which is, I'm like, wouldn't they want to have a little bit more, a tighter leash on the stuff that you could just fling out there and could go anywhere, It was always an interesting perspective. And I remember being in Sangin in 13 as an advisor and having the battalion commander from 3-4 deny our request for fire support because they wanted the Afghans to fight, which they were fighting. And I was like, fine, we'll just use Afghan mortars. And they're obviously not as accurate as the weapons that we could bring to bear. So we have to consider that these guys are just going to start flinging mortars in the general direction, and it may be off a little bit, but.
Well, Justin, you know that in those really hypercharged environments, they're frustrating, and people, your friends are out there at risk, and unfortunately sometimes getting hurt and dying, and you're at risk. A lot of times it doesn't make sense, and you begin to, especially there becomes almost this animosity between echelons of command. For sure. Oh, they're all screwed up, but I promise you, first fire team is thinking that about the squad. And the squad's thinking about that, about the platoon, and the platoon's saying company, and the company's battalion. It just goes on and on and on. When the reality, if you peel it back, it's like the vast majority of the time, everyone is trying to do the right thing. Yeah. And but I remember, one of my great memories, and I don't know that this has been written too much about. 1st Marine Regiment, it became this the epicenter of the universe around Fallujah, even though 2-4 was doing unbelievable work in Ramadi at the time. Everybody in the Sun showed up to help us. So these guys, these tier 1 soft guys showed up, and they were unbelievable team players. And at night, if we were in the COC and something was going down and we would have something, happening, I'd feel like a tap on my shoulder, and the guy behind me, who I knew was Will, no ranks used, would hand me a USB key with targets on it. Or they would say, hey, what are you guys going to do tonight? Well, we're going to press the city over here. We're going to do, hey, could you get if you get this building here to light up, could you drop that building for us? Or, and it was very much a handshake deal of extremely professional, committed people. And that's probably my greatest memory of that whole thing, was how well people were just willing to work together.
Yeah, for sure. I think you're right. I think a lot of times people have good intentions. Sometimes it's just sometimes it feels like the officers in charge of you are almost trying to protect their career rather than do what's the right thing sometimes. Okay.
Yeah.
So another situation from Sangan, I remember my buddy Stork was trying to drop I want to say it was a 500-pound bomb on some guys that were placing an IED in a culvert. For those that don't, it's just the little ditch underneath the road for people that don't know. And what they were doing was they were off the road a little bit. There was a building off the road a little bit that was blown up already. So there's no roof on it or anything like that. And we could see from the aircraft, there's an RPG leaning against the wall and there's a machine gun leaning against the wall. And what these guys are doing is running parts out to that IED and putting in one piece at a time, throwing it underneath the culvert and stuff. And I think the second or third time they were moving out to go do something, we had a Harrier on station. We had to time everything correctly because they told us you can't drop on the compound. We know you can see inside of it. We know that it's all bad guys, but it's still a compound, so it's not targeted. You can't target it. And so the second or third time that these guys are running out, we have a Harrier on station that's trying to like time it just right so we can bring them in at the same time they're moving out.
Yeah.
And Stork was the JTAC controlling this, and all the timing worked out. Battalion commander had approved it. And as he's coming around and he's getting ready to give the clearance, the company commander's like, hey, abort. And he's like, what? Okay, abort. He says abort. He's like, sir, why do we abort? He's like, I just want to make sure the battalion commander is really sure that we want to drop this. And I'm like, and I remember sitting there just being like, because I just happened to be in the command center at the time, and I'm sitting next to him trying to help him. Because once it gets crazy, for those in the fire sport community know, once the missions start happening, things start happening a lot. Yeah. So I was there to like deflect questions and stuff, but I just remember hearing him say that and going, he already approved it, man. Like, what are you doing? And those guys ended up getting away. And then every day after that we went over that culvert, I just went like brace myself, like, oh, please don't blow up, So it's tough situations like that.
No, you're right. You had said that you believe that officers sometimes make that call because they're afraid of getting back in their career. So I really can't answer this question because it'll take me out of running for commandant. So I hate to get involved in this. No, in all seriousness, I think, that I completely understand that perspective, especially the farther removed you are, the more distance there is between you and that other human. Most times, look, I just speak from an officer perspective. If we ever caught an officer that was making, and they exist, that was so fragile or lacked the confidence and was that eaten up with their career, if that becomes known, they're done. They don't get any points by being that person. In fact, they collapse. They collapse. A lot of times it's confidence. Every individual, you can pile on the complexity of a moment and the pressure of the moment and all the other things that go into the human dimension. And if you're the shot caller, at some point everybody's got a culminating point. Maybe it's 8 months into a deployment, maybe it's, I don't know. So I don't know what happened. I know that's a common frustration is that, that careerist bastard. It just hasn't been my experience. Although I did in my career when I was a captain, I probably would have believed that. Just that when I see the game a little more fully, what I realize is there's probably a more understandable reason, which is I didn't train that person well enough so that they had the confidence, or they didn't know they had the authorities, or whatever it was. But that's my take on it.
It's obvious, and obviously that's a single story from a single side. For me, the frustrating the part of it was like, dude, we're JTACs with all this experience, all this training. We've been put through the ringer with school and then certification after school. And then, hell, when you get to Afghanistan, you don't even go anywhere until you take a test on the rules of engagement and all kinds of different stuff, So it's like, have some faith in me. We've moved into this world where UAVs are overhead all the time. We have blimps overhead all the time, where a battalion commander could be like, hey, tell that guy on patrol to put his gloves on. And that high level leadership has too much control sometimes. It's like, just funny, let me work,
Two things on that. Number one, it's like, fire supporters, for people who don't know, they're like master watch builders. They not only going to tell you the time, but they're going to assemble this super complicated watch, and then they're going to set the alarm on the clock, and it's going, and this really intricate machine is all going to get down to this 1 second where everything's going to work, And so anything that from the outside that gums that up is so frustrating to fire sport. I totally get it. I loved being a fire sporter, and I wasn't, at your level. But the other thing I would offer is, you're 100% right about, ISR. For those that might be listening, that's like the persistent surveillance that didn't exist really in our worlds before 9/11. And then the deeper into the 2000s you went, you had all this redundant full motion video, and what you needed to do to prosecute a target or call something targetable or actionable was, multiple corroboration of multiple sources. And we created a generation of people that were looking over the shoulder all the time, because somebody that looked like me back in Tampa might have thought they had situational awareness and is asking questions like, why is 3rd Squad on the west side of the street if they're supposed to be on the east side? And you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't know. I'll ask Corporal Bellon when he gets back. It's not even, who cares? But that created an entire generation. And now we're in an era where we say, hey, we got to stay off the radio. We're not going to have air supremacy. We're going to have to operate independently and make bold, independent decisions. And that's counter to what the force learned over the past 30 years. And so that's a big ask now, And so culturally, we're working to overcome that.
Yeah, it's tough because as a leader, especially in a higher position where there's retribution on you if your Marines do something bad, if you had the capability to have full motion video of something that's happening and you weren't using it, then they'd be like, why didn't you use that? Why weren't you watching your guys? You know, so it's like it's a real catch-22, I guess. But yeah, it's very frustrating when you're a sergeant, or something like that. And it's like, man, let me be the professional. Like, don't tell me I'm the backbone of the Marine Corps and then tell me that I can't do this because I'm not. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? It's like a weird.
I completely get it. And the good news is, when you're ready to shave and get back in the game, you don't have to shave. You probably get in some like super JTEC unit that can let you. And you color your beard gray now and everything. So you got the full disguise going. I would say that now the way we are intentionally training NCOs and junior officers is with that in mind. Hey, you can't ask for permission. And for senior leaders, you have to trust them. Mm-hmm. And that means be tolerant of when we got it wrong, because we're going to get it wrong. Which is kind of the way I was raised in the late 80s and early 90s, because we just didn't have all this. Yeah. And so you would be told, go out on patrol, you got 2 comm windows, make the comm window, you had a shackle sheet, you're on the radio for like 18 seconds, and that's it, But then you fast forward, by the time I'm a battalion commander, I'm wearing like 3 radios myself, smartwatch, talking to, so we're hopefully going back to that trust tactics. Yeah. Because if we can't be bold, if small unit leaders cannot be bold, then the adversaries we're facing now are going to be really difficult to deal with.
I agree. And I think, on that, what you guys did in the first Battle of Fallujah was a bold movement, right? Like, we can't go unanswered here. And our role here is to do, to fight these guys. So let's just go. And I think and for those that don't know, what happened there was the politicians got in and they're like, hey, we want this. We don't want to be seen as the people overtaking this super religious city with all these mosques. I think it has more mosques than any other city in Iraq. And they were like, we need to let the Iraqis take care of this and give them the opportunity to take care of it. And that's why they pulled the Marines back. Yeah. Then led to the situation where you guys watched them reinforce. But I mean, so your frustration was probably similar to mine. When you're on the ground and you're listening to what's coming over the news or the politicians talking about it from their perspective, but you're watching guys build reinforcements and bring in fighters, and you're like, whatever you're saying over here is not working. Like, all we're doing is letting them get better. I mean, so it's not like that frustration is not shared among a lot of us,
I'll tell you, like one of the first nights after the contractors were hung from the bridge, I remember sitting at a table with Sparky Renforth and John Toulon. John Toulon was the boss, and saying and being adamant about how we needed to drop the bridge, how we needed to blow up the bridge, and I'm just pushing Toulon, who was a huge man. He was an enormous rugby player. He had hands the size of Christmas hams, giant. Could have just crushed me easily. And I'm just having one of these emotional, like, sir, we got to blow that bridge. The Americans were hung from that bridge. And he just brought his hand down on the table, boom, and made it very clear we weren't blowing the bridge. And, we're not going to blow the bridge. You have to rebuild it later, on and on. And looking back on it, I'm embarrassed because I was emotional. It's okay to be passionate, but when you start getting emotional, it skews your judgment. And I'm really proud of that moment from him, because he could have easily said, okay, drop it. He didn't. You know, he was playing his position, which was be the calm, experienced person. We're going to take the city, not drop the bridge. You know, and yeah. So I felt the frustration. I still do, man. I still do. And 9 times out of 10, when I get a couple more laps around the track and I look back at myself and being frustrated about stuff, I'm embarrassed because I didn't understand the whole picture.
Yeah.
I try to be intentional about sharing that now. Like, hey, explaining the why as much as I can now.
That's huge. And I think that explaining why things are happening the way they are would ease so many minds of guys that are in, or make them, you know, make a situation that sucks more like palatable, I guess. You know, like, hey, at least I know why we're here. It's stupid. Yeah. Maybe it's a stupid reason or whatever, but I understand. You know what I'm saying? And you're right, like you were saying earlier, everybody hates hire. Doesn't matter what level you're at. We always just hate hire. You know, battalion screwed me, regiment screwed me. You know, I remember my buddy. He was a forward observer with, I can't remember which company. It was I think it was India when we were 3-6, and they were trying to get permission to blow up a compound, and the battalion commander had already said no. And I was like, you know, battalion commander said no, man. Like, we're not doing it. And then a couple days later, someone, I don't know if he directly was involved, but someone from the company decided to do like a Mark 19 range in Afghanistan. Here's our target grid. And I'm like, I look up the grid and I'm like, it's that compound. And it was a compound that they had found multiple IEDs in. And it was like, you know, a trouble spot. And I'm like, bro, you can't just go blow up I already told you, the battalion commander said no. You know what I'm saying? So in that moment, I'm like, this dude hates me. You know, and sometimes I hate, you know, so.
But good for you, because, you know, that's what happens on long deployments. People get tired and they get frustrated, and, you know, you gotta watch each other, you know.
Yeah, it's tough. You know, the complacency to, one, not do your job, or two, like, go low or native, you know, it is always there, right? It's a weird mind game. And I think that's why you talk to people that come off deployments, and you keep in touch with those people because you've grown so close, because you're around them. They understand you. You've literally lived and worked and ate and everything with them. You know, it's hard to not grow close, but it's also great that you're still capable of telling each other, like, hey, that's wrong, man. Like, hey, you need to do that better. And that's a great thing about the Marine Corps, is you're always around people that want to be better. And every level you go to, that's, you know, it's just like, I don't know. Everyone just wants to be good at their job. Like, some jobs, obviously. Some jobs, I guess people probably don't care as much. But
you know, my last deployment in Iraq, before I started going to Afghanistan, I was a battalion commander, and it was a reserve battalion. You know, we got noticed and then activated and sent. We were going to the Haditha area, and during our workup, I remember getting a report. The average casualties for a Marine Infantry battalion. In that time was 19 dead and over 200 wounded. You know, that was the cost of it's crazy, right? I mean, it's crazy. And so, you know, I had two long deployments. I had over 2 years in Iraq already, been through both battles of Fallujah, and I was able to watch great units, you know, and units that struggled, you know, and I was part of a pretty good unit. And so I was very clear in my mind of exactly what we had to do to prepare, especially as a reserve battalion, to go to Iraq to mitigate that cost, you know. And we worked so hard. I mean, we did so many presentation drills and shooting drills. The idea was, if they're exceptionally confident in their ability to employ their personal and individual weapons, it would give them a fraction of a second more to make a decision. They weren't going to panic shoot nearly as much. You know what I mean? Like, some convoys get hit, and maybe they're not a victor unit, maybe they're a support unit, and they're just going to start spraying everywhere, you know. Where you get a really good unit, you know, out there on the street, they're doing some precision shooting, and they're able to discern, you know, their targets and positive ID and all those things. So that was one thing we did. We did a ton of first aid We did live tissue training with animals. I know that's not popular anymore. You can't do it, but we did it.
Oh, is it no longer a thing now?
I don't know. I think it's really difficult to do now, but we did all that stuff, tension pneumothorax, blast injuries, putting in an airway on something that lost its face, and they had to keep these animals alive as they were within a tactical situation where simunitions are being shot at them. So, covering, concealment, suppressive fire, all those things were happening. So, by the time we were about to leave to Iraq, the last thing we did with the officers, got them together, and I don't know why this popped into my head. I said, no, listen, especially the lieutenants, I want you to listen to what I'm telling you. The majority of your job now is to protect the Marines from themselves. The way the contacts are happening, it's going to be run by your Marines. And what we don't want them to do is to be 40 at some barbecue someplace and something comes home to roost on them. That's things that they did. We set the moral compass. We accept the risk and put ourselves out there to demonstrate, a restraint in a way that is courageous and righteous, so that when they come out of this deployment, the idea is they're empowered and enabled by it, and not the victims of it.
Yeah.
And I just remember, looking at them. I was like, we were at Camp Lejeune, and when you're talking to a room full of people like that, sometimes some places you can tell it's landing. Other people are like, what is this guy talking about?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's how it goes down, as you know. That's the reality of that environment.
That is the reality. That is the reality, and I think that's a lot of guys' reality today. Guys like me, who I'm completely comfortable with everything I saw and did, and I mean, when I first came back from singing, I remember for a little bit I was drinking like probably a half a bottle of rum a day. Just kind of getting back into the real world,
Sure.
And within a couple. I wouldn't say I was drinking daily for a couple months, but after a little while, I stopped that, and I was just like, all right, kind of jumpy still a little bit, but overall I feel all right. But there are guys out there that not necessarily like they did some kind of evil war crime or whatever, but they're like, what was it all for? What was it all about?
Well, last summer, the scenes out of HKIA,
tough.
Really, really tough for anybody who served in that era. But I think what I believe, and this is I'm not qualified to say this, but that never stopped me before anyway. But violence in any form, it's like a toxin. Mm-hmm. And when you're around it and you're dealing with bodies and the awful things that happen to civilians and the things that our young men and women see, smell, hear. And then to expect them to be okay, I mean, you have to understand, they have to know in their heart that even when awful things happen, we're there for the right reasons. My leadership is sound. I'm not a bad person. Otherwise, they become victimized by that thing. Mm-hmm. And substance abuse and all those other things compounded.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. And everybody deals with it their own way. And, I always heard that, there's a stigma if you seek out mental health, people will push down. And that, I'll be honest, that's not something I ever really saw in my time. And I remember coming back from Marja with 3-6 in 2011, and one of my scouts who saw most of the stuff, the company he was with got into a lot of contact, and he got blown up once and stuff like that. And I remember him coming back and being like, hey, Sergeant, like, I can't sleep. He was almost in tears, like, there's something wrong. And I was like, let's go talk to Chief, let's go to medical and talk to Chief, or do you want to talk to Chaplain, And that was like my immediate response. And I remember I was a sergeant, and I told my staff sergeant, who was the battalion fire or the regimental fire chief at the time, I was like, hey, I'm taking him over here. And no one was like, no, quit being a pussy. Yeah. There was nothing like that. Yeah. So I think the help is out there. I think a lot of it is our own pride, and guys that maybe having issues don't want to admit that, like, hey, man, something might be wrong here. And, that guy having the courage to come up and be like, I can't sleep. I just need to go talk to somebody. And I pass it off to the professionals and let them take it. But from there, I think he did pretty well. But it's
Justin. I mean, here's the deal. You had established enough rapport and trust with that young Marine or soldier that he felt like it was safe for him to come to you.
Yeah.
And you had enough emotional shock absorber from your own experience that you were slightly different than him and knew what to do. And so, like, I would say, like, the chain of effectiveness was right there, right? Where we fail them is they don't trust us enough to come to us. or that middle person doesn't have the maturity or experience or will to offer a constructive outcome, and then the resources for them to go to are unknown. And then any of those, that chain is broken. You get people that are out there that, and even when we do everything right, like last summer, when our veterans watched what happened last summer, just awful, and because they know. They put themselves, those, here we are, 1 year anniversary, and we all think about those Marines and sailors and soldiers, who were there when that happened, and they're living with it today. And, all of us understand that, and it's just it's brutal.
Yeah, for sure. It was I remember an immense feeling of pride seeing the Marines running through the airport and stuff. And then, it was just, I don't know. The whole thing was just crazy. You're still active duty, so I'm not going to get into the politics of it and stuff like that. I don't want to put you on the spot for anything like that. But obviously, there was a lot of questions asked by veterans. There was a lot of, there was a lot of back and forth about the whole thing. I didn't really like that the administration pushed back on the military's events. Like they put out an after action. And they were like, that's not the way it happened, kind of deal. I wasn't a fan of that. But, it is what it is. It's the military. We do what we're supposed to do. It was just tough seeing the photos of those Marines carrying their dead, friends.
Well, so let me offer, obviously I'm not going to talk about the politics of this thing, but let me offer, the people who may be listening later some context of things they may not know, especially if you haven't served yet. Or if it's been a while since you served. Imagine this. So anybody who served in Iraq or Afghanistan and saw the pictures of those Marines and paratroopers and what they were dealing with that throng of people so close, and the threat being a suicide bomber, it's almost an impossible task.
For sure.
Right? I mean, you know that, right? It's almost impossible. There's no standoff. You don't have the chicanes. The crowd is right on you. When we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, we would engineer our entry control points to maintain distance to give us the ability to spot threats and isolate them as far as possible. I mean, you saw it firsthand, and I know a lot of your veteran listeners did. But in that instance, imagine how close that crowd was. And then look at the Marines. The Marines were exposing themselves, and I'm saying Marines, this applies to everybody. The paratroopers who were there too. They're standing up exposed in order to do the best they can to look into the crowd to see the threats. I mean, they were taking risk to do an almost impossible task. I mean, the valor alone in that is it's hard to understand unless you're familiar with that environment. And then, after it happened, and they evacuated the wounded and removed the fallen angels. The mission didn't stop. Their brothers and sisters moved right back onto those posts and stood in the exact same spot for days. It wasn't like they called a timeout and everyone went back to their wherever they could just kind of process it. That doesn't happen that way.
No, for real. Yeah.
It doesn't have, and nobody talks about that, is the valor of those, the individual valor of those, and they're processing it the whole time also. I mean, it is extraordinary. So yeah, I mean, history will judge about, senior decision makers and all those things. That's for a later date. But what we can celebrate is, or not celebrate, it's a bad word, but acknowledge, what goes into those moments and the aftermath at that 19-year-old level is extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah, every one of those, men and women on the ground are heroes for all that. The pilots that came in and flew those crazy missions, carrying hundreds and hundreds of people out at a time. It's the whole situation was crazy. And I guess this is a good segue, into retention and stuff like that, and even recruiting. When people saw that had to have been tough on recruiting numbers and retention numbers, because some people are going to look at that and be like, what am I doing? This was so mismanaged. I'm getting put into a situation that I don't have a say over. As Lance Corporal Kramer, I don't have a say. It's go over there and go over there now kind of situation. But the people at the top mismanaged it to the point where it causes problems. Why would I want to be part of an organization like that? So where do you, as a senior leader, how do you kind of...
Great question. Great question. So yes, I mean, it's pretty widely known right now that we're in a different recruiting area than we've ever been in my service. I would say probably since the beginning of the all volunteer force. Some of it's generational. The millennials are kind of getting outside of the zone for initial enlistments, and now we're into Gen Z, which is every generation is different. Mm-hmm. We heard people talk so much stuff about millennials and would they fight, and all they did was go out there and earn Navy crosses, for 20 years.
Yeah.
So, I'm not even mildly interested in people's opinion about the potential valor and sacrifice of Gen Z. They will be different, and we must figure a way to communicate with them. But the stakeholders who are involved when a young person decides to volunteer, the parents, the teachers, the coaches, the siblings, the children, the aunts, the uncles, I think we'd be naive to think that if what they saw last summer and what happened and how that all ended in Afghanistan, if we'd be naive to think that has not had an effect, right? Mm-hmm. And they get, as they get a vote on when we get people. For the currently serving force, especially this generation, because they've been through so much, they're incredibly resilient. It's fair to say, without being dramatic, everyone was wounded by that. Anybody who served or had somebody they loved that was served, it's just an awful scenario. But I do believe that what will happen is, it took us a long time after Vietnam to win the confidence of the American people. And by the time 9/11 came around, there's a waiting list to get into the Marine Corps. At one point there was a 2-year waiting list. Yeah. In some parts of the Marines. So the American people will respond. And it's on us to win their confidence, and everybody's got to play their position. I'm not an elected or appointed official. I'm a United States Marine. And I have a responsibility to coach, teach, mentor, develop, identify talent, and empower them beneath me, and to adjust with the times. Everyone throws, so-and-so is woke. Okay, wait a minute. Are they woke, or are they just stretching to understand and to communicate effectively with the next generation? Mm-hmm. We took a number of social media leaders out to 29 Palms, some of your buddies, I think, Armstrong and a few other cats out there for our ITX, our CAX, our integrated training exercise. Mm-hmm. And, what they saw is what I saw when I was a second lieutenant. I watched platoons down in these awful gravel ditches, trying to get through a breach, crawling over brass that was probably from my platoon more than 3 decades ago, to solve the problem and give everything they could to close with an enemy, crawling under live machine gun fire. They're willing to do it. We just have to set the conditions where they trust us. And is that such a bad thing that we got to occasionally earn the trust of the American people? No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, you got to you got to make it a desirable occupation.
Yeah.
Like I enjoyed and I even with my own perspective and things I dislike about the Marine Corps and stuff like that, I still encourage people to join. I'm like, hey, look, it's like every other job. There's going to be stuff about it you love, and there's going to be stuff about it you hate. The good thing about it is if you have a boss that you hate, within 2 years, you or him are probably going to be gone. So that makes it a little easier. But the opportunities that you get while you're in I remember giving when I got out, I was using my GI Bill to go to school, and in one of my classes I had to give a speech about, I don't remember what it was, but I was talking about the military, and I'm like, yeah, I've been to 15 countries, I've gotten to do this and that, and all these college students are sitting there like, what the heck? And I'm like, look, there's a lot to it. It's not just going to Iraq and pulling triggers, man. There's so many jobs. I'm like, there's stuff out there you've never even heard of. I was like, look at during the pandemic, we pull the hospital ships out, and they get deployed out to New York, or they go to San Francisco or wherever. Those dudes, that wasn't a one-off thing. Those guys are out all the time, South America, going places and helping these like places Haiti, places that have been hit by hurricanes or earthquakes and stuff. And that's kind of something that I try to do is like tell people like, hey man, just because you join the Marine Corps doesn't mean you're going to combat. There's every job in the civilian world, there's probably a military counterpart. The only difference is, you got to get up and go work out in the morning. You got to go shoot every once in a while, even if you're an admin person. But unless you want to go be in combat arms, you're not going to be out there running through ranges and doing crazy stuff. There's a lot of options out there, and
That's right.
you talk to, I mean, talk to someone that's a C-130 crew chief, and they're going to tell you they got the best job in the Marine Corps. You know, they get to fly the world, bring a cooler onto the plane, never lack for room. You know, there's just so many opportunities out there for people. So
yeah, it's funny. So one of the other hats I wear is I am the senior Marine, kind of coordinating Marine Corps activities in Southcom. That's, you know, Central America, Latin America, and South America. So we send teams into Brazil to teach combined arms, and then we learn riverine, you know, tactics. We send them to Chile to do cold weather training in the, you know, in the southern hemisphere in the Andes Mountains. Mm-hmm. So there's all kinds of things that are always happening. We tell every lieutenant, you know, I use the same line every time. So if you're a lieutenant and you haven't heard us yet, hit pause. You're probably not going to get rich in the Marine Corps, but you're going to get wealthy. And that same goes for the Army too. You know, you'll meet people that will be in your life forever. Mm-hmm. You'll suffer through emotional frustration and hopefully not, but sometimes tragedy, and you will become a much stronger, fortified person.
Oh, for sure. You definitely come out more resilient because you're used to like micromanagement at the most highest levels, and you can, you know, work through that. But you also, like, for me, you know, I think one of the most impactful things was going to like Africa, you know, being in Djibouti and seeing like the refugee camp out there and seeing like the real poverty, you know, and it gives you, or being in like in Sangin, you know, living in like a little mud structure that we were staying in.
You see some little girl and you realize she has no prospects.
Nothing. None. You know, they're excited to get a ballpoint pen. You know, that's like the end of the world for them. They can't believe it. And then you come back to the States and you're like, man, it's like hard to hear people complain about stuff. It's like, dude, we got it pretty good, man. We got it pretty good. You know, I can literally do anything almost from my phone. You know, I've brought this up a few times now, but it's like I can order food and not even ever get off my couch and have it delivered. There's people out there that may not have eaten in the last couple of days. Yeah. You know, it's just such a different world, and it gives you that world perspective of stuff. And it was kind of interesting coming back and being in college and people like, oh, you know, America has no culture, or, you know, you get these like negative viewpoints about the US. And I'm like, have you ever even actually been anywhere? Or are you just like repeating what other people have told you? Yeah. And, you know, that's what you find out. They're just repeating the thing. And it's like, go out and see stuff. You know, America has a ton of culture. Get around. Every state is like almost like a different country. You know, we're so vast.
I do offer, like, you know, for this, some kind of uninformed biases about the military is for that it's everyone thinks the same. Everyone feels the same. No one ever pushes back, that it's always yes sir, no ma'am, you know, kind of stuff. Yeah. It could not be further from the truth. Yeah. You know, there is a ton of meritocracy, and if you're in the right unit, you know this, where the CO says, okay, let me have it. I mean, it gets raw and real fast. Mm-hmm. You know, and everyone gets it out of their system. Everyone says their piece. Yeah. Is there a little bit of dignity and bearing involved? A little bit. And is that such a bad thing? No. You know, and also you meet people that there'll be times where you don't know what their politics are, because it should not be important. We should be apolitical. This is about the mission, submitting our own, you know, egos and ambitions in order to do something for the collective whole. And it's a great way to spend at least a chapter of your life if you're so inclined.
Yeah, on the politics side, I remember having many, probably the most interesting political conversations I've ever had with other people within the military, officers and enlisted, that were either Republican or Democrat or whatever, and hearing their perspective. But then it was like, oh, cool. And then we went on and did our job, you know, like no one cared. I remember one guy was upset when Hillary Clinton we were on ship, and he was like, oh, when she didn't get elected, he's like, oh, you know, I can't believe Trump. But it wasn't like he's like, I'm not working today. You know, it was like, we went on and we had a mission not too long after that, you know? So it was like, it's not that big of a deal. So yeah. So let's shift real quick too, because you are in the reserves. Obviously you're the commanding general of the reserves.
But I'm also a reservist. I am.
How is that transition from active duty to reserve for you? Did you come in with some preconceived biases? Did you have biases like, oh man, these guys?
Well, you know, so I did my first tour as an infantry officer. Then I became a judge advocate for my second tour, my B billet, and I really missed the infantry. I missed that intimate relationship with Marines. I'm not saying it wasn't great, being a judge advocate and dealing with Marines there, but I just missed it.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got out, first of all, the day I got out, I was driving off the base of Camp Pendleton, and no kidding, it felt like as I drive through the gate, my windshield got like 10 times wider. My whole horizon unfolded. And then there was a big transition, and I was working for a law firm in Los Angeles County and flying around the world doing that. And but I really knew I needed to kind of break up with the Marine Corps slowly. So I joined the reserves as I was on terminal leave. And initially, it was really hard to balance. And I was in a stash job on the battalion staff, and I was still a captain. I'm like, okay, I'm going to get over this real quick. And then I started to I caught myself looking. I was at Camp Talega. Have you ever been there?
No, I haven't.
North End. So remember, you've seen Heartbreak Ridge with Clint Eastwood?
Oh yeah. Never mind. I have been there. Sorry.
Yeah, that's where it was filmed. For the people that don't know, that the Quonset huts and all that looked exactly the same when I showed up there in 1997, I think it was. And I was in the Quonset huts where the battalion staff was, and I'm one step above making coffee for somebody. But I would watch right across the alley on Sundays as Alpha Company came back in. And I started to see the staff NCOs and the way they messed with each other, and the Marines walking around in these dirty CVC suits and this, smell of diesel exhaust. And I started getting this, well, maybe I'll try to get over there before I get out. And long story short, I became the company commander. And then from that time on, I have been very blessed because I've taken my job, whatever it is, very seriously. Mm-hmm. And made sure I was learning whatever I was doing, because of what we talked about earlier. I knew that the Marines, I didn't have to be the skinniest guy in the world or the prettiest guy, but as long as I knew my job, whatever leadership failures I had, I would be fine. I could repair my leadership failures. But if I didn't know my job, then bad things were going to happen. So I always tried to learn, and I learned from anybody who would teach me. And I really enjoyed it. It became like a balance for me. So as I kind of went on in the corporate world, it was a totally different vibe when I would show up on Fridays for drill. And I would do it once a month, and it just became one of those things where it balanced. And then my wife and my family were extremely supportive. She was okay with me doing it, which was, I know, it's huge.
For sure. And
then finally, when I started getting activated after 9/11, my peers, guys like Sparky Renforth, who I've mentioned, the current ACMAC lieutenant, General, then Lieutenant Colonel Eric Smith, Roger Turner, Bill Journey, all these guys who were MEF or division commanders, they all, when I knew them as majors and lieutenant colonels, for whatever reason, they took an interest in me, and they never treated me like shit. They always taught me. They decided somehow, even though I might have been really gorked up, that I wanted to learn, and they taught me. And that's what carried me on. That's how it happened for me personally. My peers, my active duty peers, gave a what about me, and they taught me, and I paid attention.
Yeah. I considered the reserves on my way out. I had friends that were at 4th Anglico and 3rd Anglico that were like, hey man, we'd love to have you. We could always use another JTAC-E. It'd be great for you to come on. You could just come right in, And for me, it was I feel like unlike you, where you wanted the slow break, I was like, I think I need a clean break. I was like, I need to, because if I don't, then what am I doing? I'm in my 30s. What am I doing? I gotta have some kind of focus with my career here, and I can't have one foot on one side and one foot on the other. And my concern was, this is in 2018. The war is not over yet,
Yeah.
And I was like, what if I start school and I'm in the reserves, and then I get pulled and to go on a deployment, and now I can't finish school. And that was one of my biggest. And I was also like, you know what? I think all the stuff that I don't like about the Marine Corps is still going to be there. Just the little games that, just the little stuff that you just get kind of tired of being in your 30s. I'm like, I don't need someone to tell me to take my hands out of my pockets. I don't need someone to tell me to get my hair cut. If my hair needs to be cut, I'll cut it. It's just
not a problem for me to understand.
all those little things. I was like, I think if I go into the reserves, that kind of the frustrations that I have are going to carry on, and it could also limit my possibilities in the real world because I'm not making a clean break. Same reason why I didn't go contracting. I had a bunch of contracting offers when I first got done. And I was like, man, that's good money, You know, even stuff that wasn't over in war zones. I was like, that's good money, but what am I going to do at the end of this contract?
Yeah.
You know, I'm still in my 30s. I'm still looking for a new career.
So, you know, what's interesting about you is that you still found a way to answer your call to service. I mean, this is what you're doing. You're in this space and you're trying to contextualize service. You're trying to pass on information. So your call to service is still active. You know, for me, you know, I use this term a rational call to service, because if you're staying in the military, there's not a spreadsheet model in the world that could justify you staying, particularly in the reserves. You know, you're losing on a number of. But if you have this call to service, then you find people that are with you. You know, it's the relationships. But you found, you know, you and the other leaders out there in your world have found a way to continue to serve on your own terms.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I grew up as a military brat, kind of. My dad was in the reserves. He was in, you know, I remember him going to the Gulf War. I remember being a little kid and watching him get on the bus and doing all that stuff. And the military was just something that was always present in my life. You know, I didn't watch old Western John Wayne movies. I've seen Sands of Iwo Jima, you know, and I've seen like Midway and all these other like old school war movies. I didn't watch the other stuff. So the military's always kind of been there, and military history is something that's kind of always interested me. I mean, as a sergeant, I remember reading Chesty. You know, who does that? That's like, you know, not a lot of dudes are out there reading that book, but I found it to be interesting.
You're a lifer.
Yeah, and I remember getting out, and everybody talks about doing podcasts, and we should do a podcast. And I just remember thinking, like, man, I have so many buddies that have done so many like crazy things, because all these guys I know that are JTACs, you know, that have done all this stuff. And no one knows about it, you know, except for them and maybe the people that were there. And maybe it should be that way. I don't know. But I feel like in the history books, you know, because all history books are wave top, mostly, they're never going to get mentioned. And the things that they may have done or experienced may never be put out there. So that's why I started the podcast. And I put it like, hey, man, even if maybe you don't want to talk about it or you don't like it, but think about your great grandchildren hearing this. Yeah. You know, like that history, that family history, they're going to hear you speak and tell your side why you did what you did or what you did, you know. And so I guess I'm still serving, but it's, I just think it's a great opportunity to have people that their stories may not be, you know, history book worthy.
So I do something, you know, as the senior Marine reservist now, and as somebody who's stuck around, you know, I am passionate about making sure that the equities, interest, capabilities, and potential of the reserves are understood. Because, you know, even though you were in during wartime, we're like any other big bureaucracy. There's unfair biases and prejudices out there that have to be re-educated all the time. And when I was in the 90s, late 90s, you know, nasty reservist was a term, you know. And then I personally, you know, my first deployment, I was kind of, when I was on the baton, I was a little self-conscious about being a reservist, because, you know, it's like, yeah, we're here with the varsity, and, you know, I don't know, it's been a while. But then after my first deployment, I realized nobody cares. You know, the environment certainly doesn't care, and either you can or you can't. And what branch, you know, whether you're active or reserve, in reality, when you're doing it for real, doesn't matter. Because there's plenty of posers on active duty, and there's plenty of incompetent people in the reserves, but there's also plenty of professional warriors in both who are honorable. And so for me, I've stayed in, you know, I got past the fun stage, you know, and into the stages been in, you know, recently, where I'm just adamant about making sure that people understand the opportunities within the reserves, and they're immense and growing. I mean, I would have loved to have joined a reserve component that exists now and what's about to happen. I mean, we're buying boats, we're doing ops in South America, we're all over the place, and we have exceptional talent that have been, you know, from lessons hard learned by your generation that are still teaching new Marines, and they are just way better than we were in the late 90s. So that's my position on the field now, is to convince the Marines who are currently serving, hey, this is worthy of your sacrifice. It's hard as hell, man. I get it. You know, by the time Thursday of a drill weekend rolls around, you're like, I can't do this anymore. And then by Saturday of a drill weekend, you've got the oxygen mask on and you're breathing pure oxygen. and that lasts for 28 days until you're about ready to drop again.
Yeah.
But man, the sacrifice is worth it, and the opportunities are about to unfold for the reserve component are unlike anything I could have imagined when I joined.
I've only heard good things from the guys, mostly good things from the guys that I know that are with like the Anglo. That's who I mostly know are the Anglo guys, but they love it. And they're like, we get to do all this awesome stuff. We're jumping, because they still have their jump mission. We're going on operations during combat. When the war was on, they were also going out and supplementing like first and second and fifth Anglo on these Georgian liaison teams and these special operation task force and stuff like that. So it's cool stuff. It sounds great. And I mean, I think it's an opportunity for guys that may be on the fence, because the reality is guys get out and some of them don't know what they're going to do. They don't,
That's right.
They haven't lived in the real world for years now. Yeah. So it's like, oh, I got to go to an apartment. Oh, I got to go get a job. Oh, I got to go
to all those active Marines who have decided, like I did. I decided I was getting out. And I knew when I joined, I wasn't going to do a career. Now I think anybody that does 20 is a part-timer. But what I would say is this: looking back in hindsight, is that if you have learned, you have this professional resume, you have learned so many things in your service. Not affiliating with the reserves and at least giving it a try, a lot of the things that frustrate you don't exist in the reserves. And even those that do, it's only there for a few days a month. Mm-hmm. And then what you'll find is there are as a percentage of the reserve component that really likes it, and they give of their own time, and they're the ones that make it all work. And it's profoundly rewarding, man. I could not have imagined I would end up being here, but I get regular DMs and phone calls from people I served with 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I know guys that travel to go to the reserve unit.
I did
on their own dime because they want to be with that particular unit and they love it so much. So, I mean, there's something there for people that are considering it. I think it's a great option for a lot of people, especially, I mean, if you're close to retirement, I guess it's not a bad idea. I don't know why. Well, let's say if you can retire, can you retire from active duty and then go into reserves? That's not the way it works, right?
No, you can't do that. But now in this era, so you have to remember, now we're in the blended retirement era.
Oh yeah.
So as long as you're not drawing your retirement yet, you can always. There's lots of. What's going to happen in the very short future here is that it used to be like when you served and when I have served, you got off active duty, you could go in the reserves, but you certainly couldn't go back. Mm-hmm. But in the blended retirement era and the way the generations are unfolding, we are actively working the procedures and policies so that if you get off active duty, you can go right into the reserves. But if you're in the top of your game in the reserves and you're one of the best, hey, you go back on active duty, go back and forth. We just want you in uniform when we go to crisis.
Yeah.
Now, I distinctly remember putting on my uniform the first drill after 9/11 and thinking to myself in the dark, thank God I'm still a Marine. And I remember going to drill, I was still a company commander in Camp Talega, and the way Friday nights would work is, first sergeant would hold the formation, and then I would take it and say, okay, bring it in, and I'd say, hey, here's what we're going to do this weekend. Here's what's going on, And the Marines would kind of come into school circle, and the first sergeant would be yelling, well, circle again, bring it in, every Friday. And so I took the formation from the first sergeant, and I said, okay, Eddie. And as I brought my head up, looking through my cover, the Marines were almost like right here on me. I mean, I could feel them. They were that close right after 9/11. And it was the biggest company formation we ever had because anybody that was UA was back.
I was going to say, I bet it grew a lot.
Oh, yeah, man. Oh, yeah. And everybody there felt the same thing. Thank God I'm still a Marine, and when are we going to go kick ass?
Yeah.
And that imprinted on me, so I just can't imagine having been, and it could have easily been me where I could have been out, and I don't know. I've been really lucky, man.
I mean, there's a lot of guys that got out and regret it, and they're like, man, what did I do? I should go back.
Come back to us. And even if you haven't worn a uniform in 6 years, look, we want you for who you were, for sure, but more important, like who you can be. And if you are willing to, if you're one of those rare individuals that's willing to be responsible for other people and coach and teach and mentor, and that's in your heart, then come back and we'll put you in front of Marines.
That's good stuff. I think that's a good spot to wrap it up. Do you have any organizations or charities or anything you want to throw out there for people to check out?
Yeah, this is our 75th anniversary of Toys for Tots.
Awesome.
So it's the only sanctioned nonprofit, only official military activity of the Marine Corps. And I am the Marine Corps' representative for that. I am the guy responsible for our end of the Toys for Tots. So the Toys for Tots Foundation, which is run by a prior Marine and has 55,000 volunteers. And every year, last year, 7 million children were affected by that. So it started in 1947 when a Marine major and his wife were in Southern California, and they were worried when Christmas was coming. They lived in a community with a lot of war orphans. Mm-hmm. And so they started collecting toys and making toys for those orphans, and then it grew and grew and grew. And it's one of the activities of the Marine Corps Reserve. People will say, "What is this? What the hell does it have to do with warfighting?" It has to do with war fighters. It is an opportunity for us to demonstrate our values as a people to each other. It's not political. It's about making kids' lives a little bit better. And now there's a literacy program involved as well. This is the 75th year that we've been doing it. And we're going to push hard this year. We're going to try and break 10 million, make a difference in 10 million kids' lives. Yeah. So that's my charity, man.
That's awesome stuff. I remember being a kid seeing that. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. They're giving away toys. Like the Marines give away toys, they're like Santa Claus.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. That's great stuff. Do you have social media or anything that you want to put out there?
Yeah, I do. I have an official, on Instagram. You can find me and Sergeant Major Ruiz and the Marine Corps Reserve. And what we try to do is push the activities of our Marines, give you an idea of what's happening in the reserves. And if you're out there and you're a drilling reservist and you've got some cool photos of your drill weekend, or you want to show off about one of your Marines, hit me up directly and I'll push it out on the official channel at USMC Reserve. And then, I don't even remember what mine is, but you can find it.
It's out there.
Yeah.
All right. That's awesome. And if people check out my stuff, it's at Former Action Guys and at Former Action News. Have the Patreon page set up, patreon.com. Look up Former Action Guys. You can support the show there. And that's it. I really appreciate it, General Bellon. I appreciate the time and for you coming on the show.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks for having me, man. Best of luck to you.
Hey, you too.